Hi everyone! So patch 1.1.1 is coming up, and with that, major changes to Nightmare Dungeons. In particular, they're buffing the monster density quite significantly. We expect something like 40 to 60% extra monsters, at least based on the screenshots they have given us. That may differ depending on the dungeon. I imagine that especially the lower tier dungeons and the less populated dungeons will probably see a larger increase. And some dungeons like, for example, Ultra's Cave, that is already quite filled and really good, probably less so. But overall, that will make dungeons a lot juicier, a lot more loot, a lot more XP. Leveling will go faster, so that will be felt for sure. But more importantly, they're also buffing boss HP. And you can see that here. So this is the preliminary patch notes that might be slightly different in the final patch notes, but this is what I have given us a few days ago. And well, bosses are going to become a lot more tanky looking at this. Bosses at level 60 are unchanged, and then up to 80 they get 50% extra HP, and then up to 100, 100% extra, and then even more so post 100. And that will make killing bosses quite a struggle for a lot of builds that have weak single target damage, and there's actually quite many of those. So I think this is gonna actually lead to a strategy where people try to avoid bosses as much as possible. And I actually tried this out. So I went in with my creator's bar here, so just leveling it up, and I was like, why don't we just try to do like no boss runs, basically. Like in the good old days in Diablo 3, if you remember that. Well, it turns out it's not that easy after all. So I took the list of nightmare dungeons that we have, which is here, and I marked all of them that do not have a boss right now in yellow, and I just tried to avoid all of the others. Now there is 2 dungeons that have a council boss, like these knights, where there's like 3 or 4 guys together. They are not exactly real bosses, I guess, so they're probably fine to do on mini builds. So I kind of ran those as well. But it turns out there is only 5 dungeons that have no boss, and then those 2 council dungeons. So 7 out of 30 dungeons that would kind of fall into this category here. And all of the others actually do have bosses. So that is a very low number of sigils. So when you're running sigils, usually you can kind of select like maybe half or so of these sigils to run, and you can kind of just auto salvage the others. And this is usually how you play nightmare dungeons. So, you just find a bunch of sigils. You can manipulate that a little bit by, for example, doing side events. So whenever you see like a last stand event, you want to do that. So you can get a sigil drop when you kill the butcher, he drops sigils, etc. So you can get some more sigils by doing these kind of things, but it's not really all that consistent. It does help a little bit though to give you more sigils to choose from. So that's basically what I've done. I tried to just run dungeons that don't have bosses all the way, and I was able to do that maybe around half of the time. So yeah, it kind of makes sense, I guess, when I said previously that you have to run like half of the dungeons of this entire pool, so around 15 or so, usually. And, well, around 7 of these are actually in the category of no boss, or like, kind of no boss. So yeah, half the time I was able to run a dungeon without the boss. And that means that this strategy where you just never run dungeons that have bosses at all is probably not going to be a thing. At the very least, not in this season. There are other dungeons that don't have bosses, and depending on which dungeons cycle into this pool of nightmare dungeons, there's always 30 different ones every season. We'll see, I guess, maybe in season 2, there might be a lot of dungeons that don't have bosses, who knows. But yeah, for now, I don't really expect this so much to be a thing. And that means that this no boss strategy is probably kind of dead, and you need to make your build somehow have some single target damage, or else you're gonna have a really bad time coming up with this patch. Now there is one redeeming factor here. Number one is you can play in groups. So when you play at least in 2-player, you find more sigils because, well, everyone finds sigils. So if you play together, you get more sigils, more dungeons to choose from. And when there's even more than 2 people, it's even easier. So you can kind of like spam like the best like 3, 4, 5 dungeons or so in a full party. Right now there's also still an exploit where you can actually reset nightmare dungeons, but I wouldn't recommend using that. And, well, there is a third factor, which is that the density is getting buffed, which also leads to more loot drops. So, well, most of the sigils actually do come from completing a dungeon or from these side events or this chest here, for example. But for the most part, you just have more monsters, and I don't think they're gonna tune down the loot per monster. So you're also just gonna get more stuff, including more sigils. and this also includes more sigil powder coming up. So it may actually be quite possible to almost entirely skip dungeons that have bosses and then just kind of, like once in a while, struggle through one of those and you're gonna be okay. But testing the strategy for a few hours here earlier, I also identified another problem, which is you just have so few sigils to choose from that you cannot really avoid Nightmare Dungeon affixes that you don't want to run, or you just may get higher and higher sigils and you have no way to kind of like stay on the comfortable level for your character. So that is like another issue, because usually you have so many sigils to choose from that you can dodge stuff like critical resist, monster barrier, monster life, etc. Or even stuff like resource burn, but that's getting phased out now. But everyone has their own affixes that they don't want to run. But when you have only like those 7 dungeons in the pool of dungeons that have no boss and you really want to focus on these, you're kind of forced to run all of these. And this means that you have to run those crit resist maps, that you have to run those cold enchanted maps, suppressor maps, etc. And yeah, it's also kind of just slowing you down in some cases, or just really inconvenient to the point where, yeah, I would probably just prefer having a longer boss fight in a good dungeon than struggling my way through like a 60% less damage done map, basically. So there's that thing. And well, just the fact that your dungeon sigils just keep going up more and more, and you don't really have like the right tier to choose from, also just makes your runs slower and less efficient. And then comes yet another negative on this whole strategy, which is, well, some of these dungeons are really far down this list. So we have 2 out of those 7 dungeons that are down here in D tier, like basically the stuff we never want to touch. And then there's the Charnel House in B, that's kind of fine. The rest is pretty good, but yeah, like half of these dungeons that belong in this category of no boss runs are actually pretty bad, to be honest. And there's a lot of dungeons, you see here we have a lot of S tier dungeons, and 7 out of 8 are boss dungeons. Well, in conclusion, that means I don't really think this no boss strategy is actually a thing, as we had originally, and at least I had discussed that when we saw the patch notes. I don't think that you can realistically do this unless you play in groups or unless you use exploits. I wouldn't really recommend. That being said, we have some updates planned for this Nightmare Dungeon tier list. So this is the one here from Maxroll, so I took the screenshot, but we have that here. And of course, we're going to do new testing. We're going to see how the Nightmare Dungeon changes affect them. We're going to see if we have to adjust builds to maybe include more single target damage. But in some cases, that's simply not really feasible. So, you know, you just can only include so much damage in some builds, and some skills just are not designed to deal much single target damage. And we're probably going to see a lot more of those builds popping up that are similar to like Flurry Rapid Fire or like the Frozen Orb build that I played recently with Ice Shards for the boss. I think these kind of like multi-skill builds where you have like 1 AoE skill, 1 single target skill might actually become more of a thing in the future because of this boss change. But let's see how it will play out. Now, some builds will not really feel this impact of this extra boss HP. You know, their boss fight mess really fast already, and now it's just like a few seconds longer or so. But some builds are probably kind of struggling with bosses already. If you have like upwards of half a minute or so boss fights right now, it's definitely gonna feel pretty awkward, I guess, later on when you have this patch and the bosses have like double the HP. That also makes it so that maybe you want to save a shrine if you can, if there's like one nearby. Now, for some builds, the boss fights were already not really a problem at all, and I think this is one of the main reasons why Blizzard did that change. Some builds just walk in and basically one-shot them or kill them in like 5 seconds or so. But honestly, adding another 5 seconds to those builds doesn't really make much of a difference. The main problem I see is that, yeah, some builds have an easy time against the bosses, but some builds are also just like designed to be pretty good boss killers, or they have like just this really high single target potential, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. I think it's a bit problematic if like these AoE builds that may be like really fun are just getting real punished by this patch with this boss change, but maybe I'm also a bit too pessimistic on that end. Realistically, I would assume that Blizzard might do some more adjustments down the line to these dungeon bosses. I think a lot of people probably agree that it would have been much more interesting if bosses actually become harder, like for example more damage, faster, you know, any kind of extra affixes or something like that, instead of just being like a bigger like punching bag as they are now, because that doesn't really make them more interesting. And they said in the patch notes here somewhere that there's going to be like a guaranteed legendary item dropping now from those higher level bosses, so it's kind of like the payoff you get for finding these longer boss events. But realistically, I don't think this is enough to really make them such an incentive. So I think a lot of people will actually try to do this strategy. Maybe not all the time, but if you have like a really weak single target build, you probably want to take a look at this list here. When it comes to updating the max tier list, we might also start adding some icons here, so that we basically have this on the tier list as well, where you can see, okay, what has a boss, what doesn't have a boss, so that you have the perfect overview there. And that also sums up my points here about this no boss strategy. So in short, there's not enough dungeons in the pool to really only run dungeons without a boss. However, with exploits or in groups, that is quite feasible. But realistically, I would not really suggest it, and you should probably make a build that has good single target damage if you want to have a good time in the coming patch. So that's it. Hope you liked this, and I'll see you guys next time.